Hello, and welcome to New Beginnings Baptist Church. We are so glad that you've chosen to join us today for this time of worship. My name is Pastor Brian, and our goal here is to help you to know and love God more. We believe that God has something special planned for you during this time. So let's hear from God's Word now.
The story of Abraham and Sarah. Now, there's a lot of different things. In culture, they often went by their Hebrew name as well as the cultural name. And so Abram is Abraham. Sarai is Sarah. They are married. They did have a slave, Hagar, the Egyptian slave. So you kind of understand the storyline. And we'll get to where I kind of fill in some of the blanks, because if you've never heard this story before, we're jumping into the middle of it. But what I want you to see is that they are waiting patiently for a promise from God that they had received years ago, and it seemed to never be coming. It seemed like God was never going to answer his promise or answer their prayers. Isn't that a scary word for us? Never. Never. That word can stir up some of the deepest fears inside of us. I will never find a job. I will never get better. My life is never going to get better than this. My family is never going to get better than this. My relationships are never going to get better. Or maybe we're expecting something to happen and we will think and hear this voice inside of us that says, that will never happen. And when that comes in, when we hear those words of never, then all of a sudden we start becoming afraid. We start fearing the things that we've thought were going to happen, but will never happen again. Probably the one that often gets us the most, though, is that God will never hear my prayers. Have you ever felt that before? That God will never hear your prayers, or God will never answer your prayers? Many of us, probably if we were being honest, we felt that at some point in our life or another. We will admit that we have that fear that God is never going to do what we believe he can do. And when that never starts attacking our life, when we have those feelings of never come in, and the days turn into weeks, the weeks turn into months, the months turn into years of waiting and waiting and waiting on God, that trusting God becomes something that seems distant. Seems difficult for us to trust God when it seems like he will never answer. Those nevers of life are often discouraging. I will admit it. They expose our fears and push us to the breaking points. If you have ever waited for an answer from God, if you have ever wondered why God delays in his answer, or if you've ever questioned if God even hears your prayers, then this message today is for you. It's for us. It's for all of us. And I want you to know for certain that even though you don't see God at work, even if it doesn't make sense to you, God is working. Amen. God is going to answer our prayers in his time. Amen. I love this verse. God has promised in Isaiah 64:6 that he will act on behalf of those who wait for him. Those who wait on God, God promises he will act. And I love even more the one in Deuteronomy chapter 31, where God promises that he will never leave us, never forsake us. He will never let us down. Those are the nevers we need to remember. Not the nevers of it seems like God will never hear me, but remember that God has promised he will never leave us. He will never forsake us. He will never abandon us. So when we start wondering about, will God ever hear my prayers? Will God ever answer our prayers? When we are in that waiting period, let us remember that God says he will never, ever, ever leave us. When we put it into context, when we put that word never into the right place, all of a sudden it's not so scary for us. It's not so disheartening. It's not so frightful for us. But when we hear that God will never leave us, all of a sudden that's pretty amazing. Wouldn't you say? To have the promise that God will never, ever, ever leave you, that's pretty reassuring. That's pretty comforting, at least to me. But I want you to see during this series that we're calling Waiting on God, we're going to see what happens when we choose not to wait on God and take matters into our own hands. Today we're looking at Abraham and Sarah. So let me give you a little bit of the backstory, a little bit of history. If you have never studied Genesis before, if you've never studied Abraham's story before, this will help to fill in some of the clues, and you can read it in the previous chapters. Chapter 12, chapter 13, 14, 15, it keeps going. So here's what it is. Chapter 12, God calls Abraham to leave his extended family and his country, the country whom he loves, the country he grew up in, he knows the best. God says, leave, and I will show you a promised land. You have to leave, though. Could you imagine hearing that conversation? I'd be like, God, can I have a GPS map to where we're going? Can I have an idea of where my final destination is? Because I don't like just getting on the road and driving to unknown places. I kind of need to know where general direction I'm heading. I mean, you get out here to the crossroad, and you could either go west or east. God, which one do you want me to go? God, do you need me to go south, or do I need to turn around and go north over here? God, which way? But God told Abraham to leave, and he will show him. And then God makes a wonderful promise to him. He said that, Abram, you will be made a great and mighty nation. Abraham's like, wait a second, I'm old and I have no children. How am I going to be a nation? Like, is it going to be a nation of two where it's me and my wife? Like, when I think of nation, I think of a large country, a population of a considerable size. I'm sure Abraham did as well. And it's like, wait a second, how is this going to work, God? And God had to get a little bit more in detail. It's like, fine, I will explain this to you just a little bit more. I'm going to give you descendants that will outnumber the stars in the sky. Let that sink in. The stars in the sky, your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and further on, they will be so numerous that they outnumber what you can see in the sky. Which, by the way, they didn't have a lot of the light pollution that we do now, so they could see a lot more stars than we can. So, Abram's getting all of this, and it says, Abram believed God. Man, that's a good statement. Abraham believed God. But then time passes. Since the promise earlier, it's been about 10 years. Since God told him he was going to have children and he was going to have descendants, it's been 10 years' time. And he is now even older than he was. And he's like, wait a second, God. I'm getting a little bit too old here, because if you give me a child now, could you imagine having a kid now at your age? Like, I'm thinking for me, I'm young, I understand that. But to have a newborn right now, I'm like, I don't know that I would keep up with a newborn. I love newborns in our church. I love little children in our church. I get to play with them. I get to hold them. I get to love them and then send them home. It's a wonderful blessing for all of us. Especially me, because I send them with the parents. But I love them around, but this was getting old for Abraham. And he's like, I'm getting up there in age, not wondering if I can do anything with this kid if he comes along now. And so Sarah understands the frustration, as wives often do. And as a loving wife, she comes up with a plan. See, Sarah was not told specifically that she was going to be the mother of the children of Abraham. That hadn't happened yet. It happens later. But at this point, Sarah's like, well, God told you you were going to have descendants, but I'm not in that promise. So as a loving wife, she convinces to do a common practice in those days of having a handmaiden bear the child for the mistress. The wife of the owner, the wife of the master, this slave, which we have in our world today, that is a negative connotation. It could have been a negative connotation back then, but there was a lot of good purposes for that word, which is why I love using the word handmaiden more than slave, because a lot of times they would choose to follow a certain couple because of the life they provided. And it was better than what they could get where they were at. So, nonetheless, we see here, it seems like for Abraham and Sarah, those nevers start creeping in. And when those nevers start creeping in, what do? We often turn to our own plans instead of God's, don't we? We're like, I'm going to decide to help God out a little bit. I think he needs my help. We've waited 10 years. Maybe God doesn't understand how this thing works, having children and descendants. Maybe God's busy with something else around the world, so I'm just going to try to help him out. And what I want you to see here at the beginning of this is Sarah's motives are not bad. A lot of times we put Sarah immediately into the bad corner. Sarah, this was a bad idea. You need to get over there in the bad corner. You didn't believe in God. Actually, when we look at this in context, she did believe God. She believed God's promise to Abraham. She believed that Abraham was going to be the father of many children. She just didn't know where she fit in. So her motives were good and genuine, and she even showed faith in God's promise, but she didn't understand that God meant the promise for her as well. And so when she turned to her own plans, when she trusted her own ideas, when Abram gave in, which, by the way, I don't have time to explain it, but doesn't this story sound familiar? Husband hears from a wife, and it was a plan not from God, and then the husband just gives in to the wife's plan. Not saying the wife's plans were bad, but I think we read this in Genesis chapter 3 as well with Adam and Eve. Sounds almost exactly the same. And it's not the wife's fault. It's the fact that we have an enemy who wants to distract and take away from God's plans. And our flesh is so weak that we often give in to those. But this plan was all wrong. Sarah wasn't exactly wrong. The plan was wrong. Because she didn't trust God, she trusted her own schemes. She trusted her own ideas. It was wrong because it was not God's plan, but it was also wrong because it was wrong against Abraham. It was wrong against Hagar. It was wrong against even Sarah. And it ended up being wrong against even their children. But God still works. And I love this. This first concept of us turning to our own plans, I want you to kind of understand that we can't do God's work our way. I want to say that again. We can't do God's work our way. We must do it God's way. Because God's plan, and done in God's way, in God's time, will always bring about God's promises. But often when we put in our own schemes and we try to do it in our time, in our power, that's when it all gets messed up. We will mess up God's perfect plan, and then God has to show himself gracious and merciful once again, which thank him he is. But when we do things our way instead of God's, we cause problems for ourselves. Let's look at the effects of Abraham and Sarah's impatience in the delay here. It brings about, by trying to do it their own way, by fulfilling God's promises their way, it brings about suffering. The effect of our plans always leads to suffering. In this story, we see that Sarah had this idea. Abraham went along with it. Hagar, it's like I would like to hear her side of the story in all of this, because I don't know that she understands what's going on and then all of a sudden finds herself stuck in the middle of this. But when she found herself pregnant, which she thought was normal, I mean, this was a modern practice of culture. This was not Abraham stepping out on Sarah. Sarah was inviting Hagar to be a wife. It was a common practice. God had not said it is best for a man to only have one wife, although that is a good plan, because I can only keep up with one wife. I can imagine multiples. No, this was a bad idea in my mind, but that's me. But in Abraham and Sarah's day, this was common. This was a normal practice. It wasn't to go against God, yet in their minds, this was a reasonable way that God could answer the prayers. But when we try to do things our way, it brings suffering. Let's look at how this suffering really played out. The impatience actually became doubt in God. Maybe not the existence of God, maybe not even doubt in the promise of God, but you can see that when Abraham and Sarah rely on their own methods to try to do things for God, it's doubt in God's character and it's doubt in God's power. Suffering is brought on when we start doubting God's character and God's power, and we try to do things our own way. Specifically, in this story, it brings about 3 different types of suffering here. Verse 5. Verse 4, we read that Hagar becomes pregnant, and when that all happened, Sarah and Hagar start mistreating each other, having contempt for each other. They have bitterness and anger going on between each other. But what I want you to see is that in verse 5, when we try to do things our own way, we bring about blame Blame starts playing in, and blame only leads to suffering. Sarah, in verse 5, comes to Abraham, and man, from a distance we can laugh at this, but in the moment this is painful to watch and hear. Sarah comes in, Abram, it's your fault. Abraham, I'm sure as a good husband, was like, okay, first of all, what are we talking about? I mean, that the eggs burnt this morning? Okay, I'll probably admit that. That's my fault. I left them on too long. That the lawn's not mowed? Okay, that's my fault because I was watching the football game. But what are we talking about here? Do I need to start confessing everything I know that I've done wrong to you, Sarah? And I love this. It's your fault. You are responsible for my suffering because I put my slave in your arms. Wait. I put my slave in your arms and you got her pregnant. Okay. Sarah blames Abraham. Sarah blames Hagar because she says it's her fault she got pregnant. Well, no, you kind of came up with this idea. And then even Sarah blames God, because I love this last part here. This, again, is horrible in the moment, but kind of comical when we step back. May God judge between you and me. What? We're in this together here. This was a plan we both agreed to. God doesn't have to judge between you and me because we did this together. But Sarah's like, no. My curse is your curse now. Okay. May God judge between you and me. She's blaming everybody, including God. God, why did you let this happen? God, you have to judge now who was right in this situation. Nobody? But beside that, blame keeps us isolated from God and others. When we start looking at whose fault it is that we are suffering personally, it makes division, it makes isolation something of our lives, and that's never, never, ever good. We are not created to go through this life, as some philosopher said, like an island, that we are all by ourselves. No. God created us in community. God created us for each other. We need each other, and when we start blaming each other, that's not going to be healthy. Well, it's your fault that I'm in this situation. Can't you take personal responsibility? Just throwing that out there. But blame causes further doubt. Doubt in who God is, doubt in his plan, doubt in other people. I doubt I could trust you now because it's your fault when we blame each other. But it leads to another one. It leads to pain. Verse 6. Abram replied to Sarai, "Here your handmaiden is in your hands now. Do whatever you want with her." And then Sarah mistreated her so much that she ran away. Pain. This was extremely painful. Abraham, Sarah, Hagar are all hurt by this situation. They are all suffering tremendous pain. Abraham's relationship with both Sarah and Hagar now is like, you know what? My tent's going to be moved to the back 40 and I'm going to stay there so you guys can figure this out. Sarah's like, I don't like her. Hagar's like, I don't like her. And there's a pain in between these relationships. Sarah doesn't trust Abraham now. And Hagar, as the handmaiden, the third wheel, so to say, is sitting there like, I don't even know where I fit in now. How does this all work? You invited me in, but then now treat me like garbage. I'm hurt. It's painful. And so Abraham's hurting as a husband, as a father, as a leader. He doesn't know what to do next. Sarah's in pain as a wife and a friend and a mentor. Hagar is hurting as a mother and a young believer, because in this context, we actually see that she does believe in the one true God of Abraham and Sarah. Because how else would she recognize and immediately respond to the angel of the Lord if she did not believe in the same God? See, she did believe in God, and her response later is, I can't believe my eyes. I have seen the one who sees me. And so her faith as a young believer is now in question, because she's trying to learn from Abraham and Sarah. And now what? The relationship is in strife, which is number 3. The third effect of suffering is it brings about strife. There's conflict at every level. Not just pain, but now there is exact conflict. There is a war being waged because people try to do things their way instead of trusting God and waiting on Him. There's conflict, strife. Sarah attacks Abraham. It's your fault. You're the man. It's your fault. Abraham turns on Hagar. Well, you know what? She's your handmaiden. You do with her what you want. Instead of being like a protecting husband and father saying, no, we agreed on this. She is now in this relationship legitimately. Instead of protecting, he turns on Hagar. Sarah mistreats Hagar, and Hagar then abandons her life. She's at conflict with both Abraham and Sarah. So Hagar just decides, you know what? The best thing to do is run. Just run. Which God says, no. Running's not the option. That's a whole nother message. But this is what happens when we try to help God. God, let me help you answer my prayers. Which I always love this, because when you ask, like, it's almost in every Christian poll that is almost out there, there are so many people who believe that actually the Bible teaches that God helps those who help themselves. That is not in the Bible. That is nowhere in Scripture, not even hinted to. That is not a truth. That is a lie from Satan. So when we try to help God by helping ourselves, we're actually bringing in suffering and pain and blame and strife into our lives and into our relationships. See, when we want something so bad, that's what it all boils down to. When we're waiting on God, it's because we want whatever we've been praying for or whatever we believe God has promised. We want it so bad that we will even go against God to get it. Oh, we don't like hearing that, because I would never go against a loving God like this. But we do. When we take things into our own hands, we are saying, God, you're not strong enough. You're not big enough to deal with this. You are not capable of giving these things, so let me help you. And that's never a good place to be. And by the way, when we do it that way, it will never be what we really wanted. That's what we see here. Oh, Ishmael is born. He is a descendant of Abraham. He was actually supposed to be a blessing because he's still under the Abraham covenant. He is still going to bless the land and bless the people. Those who bless him will be blessed, and those who curse him will be cursed. But Ishmael, because of all this, becomes so bitter that later we will see that it leads to internal conflict in the family. But Ishmael is supposed to be a promise. Hagar is supposed to be included in this promise as well. All this to say, we've kind of ripped this apart and seen how not to do it. But I want you to see something here. Verse 9. The angel of the Lord.
I love you, Chris.
I love that. But God. When we help God, when we trust our own schemes and our own plans, it brings suffering and it brings pain and it brings strife. But God steps in. But God is still in control. The answer to our impatience, the answer to our suffering, is to wait and look at the who, not the what, that we are wanting. When we are waiting on God, it's more important to have faith in Him and His love for us than the actual promise that He's given to us. When we fix our eyes on God and not circumstances, we will see the promises come true. I love this. 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slow to fulfill His promise, as some think, but is patient for your sake, not wanting any to perish. God doesn't want us to suffer. God wants us to look to Him, and that's why it's sometimes taking so long. This situation with Abraham and Sarah is because they weren't ready for a kid yet. They weren't ready to have the blessing of God yet. They did not have their eyes on the right prize. They were looking to themselves, not to God. And God's like, I have blessings waiting for you, but you know what? When you're ready, you'll tell me. When we've been praying for years and years and years for an answer, maybe a loved one to get saved, or maybe we're battling an illness and we're praying for healing, or maybe it is a relationship that needs to be healed, reconciled, and we've been praying for so long and we forgot to look to the God who loves us instead of the circumstances we've been praying about. What a beautiful picture of real life this is, though. I know. Looking at this situation, Pastor Brian, I would not call this issue beautiful. The issue or the situation with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael and all of this stuff going on, this is not a beautiful picture, but it is a beautiful picture of life when we look at it from the fact that we mess up and God still uses it for His glory. Amen. God still uses our mistakes and still has a plan for us in the midst of them. We blow it, we sin, and we bring suffering upon ourselves, but then God shows up, and that's grace. That's grace. We sing the song, How Great Thou Art, because He is a great God of grace. We have hope because He lives. That's grace. Grace is when God shows up in the midst of our sin and says, I still see you. And that's why Hagar comes back and says, you are El Roy. Now, not Elroy as in like the son of the Jetsons, because I know that's where some of you are thinking. But El is the Hebrew phrase for God. It is often the one they put El as like the God, the one and only true God. El stands for the one God. Roy is the one who sees me, or the God of my vision. That's the definition I want you to see is El Roy is God of my vision. When we are waiting and those nevers start creeping in, God will never hear my prayers. God will never answer my prayers. God will never step into this situation. God will never heal this relationship. When those nevers start creeping in, God needs to be our vision. God needs to be the one we look to. When it seems like things are moving too slow, God needs to be our vision. When we mess up because we help God, God needs to be our vision. That's why we need to turn our eyes to Him. That's why we need to look to God in the midst of our time of waiting. Instead of trying to fix it ourselves, trying to help God, we need to look to Him. So let me ask you, are you waiting for something from God? Have you been praying about something and are just waiting for God to step in and answer? Maybe you are looking at your life and you realize you brought on suffering because you've been impatient with God. You've been impatient in your circumstances and you have caused suffering not only in your lives, but probably the lives of the people around you. The solution is to turn our eyes to God. To keep God as our vision.